$100 million in liquid cash cannot buy a clean conscience, but it can buy decades of absolute silence. Robert Durst was the heir to a Manhattan skyline, a man who controlled thousands of luxury apartments, but chose to live in a $20 a night boarding house while wearing a cheap wig. This Robert Durst documentary explores how a man with the world at his feet became the lead character in the Susan Berman murder investigation and the infamous Morris Black case. The secret to his long-term evasion of justice was not just his family's massive political influence or a high-priced legal team. It was a specific, handwritten note found in a dusty police file that linked a real estate prince to a rotting cadaver. The machinery of the Durst dynasty began to grind toward this inevitable collapse long before the world obsessed over the Robert Durst trial. While his peers were building monuments to their family names, Robert spent his life trying to erase his own tracks from history. This is the dark history of an empire built on glass and steel that eventually shattered under the weight of a single microphone. The Jinx HBO series revealed the chilling reality of a man who turned a billion-dollar inheritance into a blood-soaked game of hide-and-seek. To understand how a prince of New York ended up in a plexiglass cage, we must look at the cold philosophy of the man who started it all. The Durst story begins with Joseph Durst, a man who understood a simple, brutal rule of the American dream. He arrived in New York in 1902 with exactly $3 in his pocket. He was a tailor by trade, but he quickly realized he did not want to spend his life sewing clothes for the elite. He wanted to own the very land that the tailor shops and the factories sat upon. By 1915, he had scraped together enough capital to buy his first building on 34th Street. He knew that in a city like New York, land is the only thing they are not making more of, and he intended to own as much of it as possible. This cold, transactional philosophy was passed down like a genetic curse to his son, Seymour Durst. Seymour was a visionary of glass and steel who viewed the map of Midtown Manhattan like a chess grandmaster. He did not just buy property. He assembled entire city blocks with the precision of a surgeon. He was responsible for the modern face of the city, turning dilapidated corners into soaring monuments of corporate power. But the atmosphere inside the Durst household was far from the polished perfection of their skyscrapers. The pressure of maintaining a multi-generational empire was toxic, creating a vacuum where empathy should have been. The trauma that would define Robert Durst occurred when he was only 7 years old. On a cold night in 1950, Robert watched his mother fall from the roof of their family home to her death. In a move of calculated psychological cruelty, his father allegedly made him watch the entire event from a window. Many believe this moment did not just break Robert, it hollowed him out entirely. He grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth and a heart of dry ice, surrounded by wealth but completely detached from humanity. While his siblings prepared to lead the family business, Robert was already retreating into a private world of shadows. As he reached adulthood, it became clear that Robert did not share his father's passion for building. He did not want to contribute to the skyline. He wanted to burn it down from the inside. He was a man who felt he was owed everything by birthright, but resented the responsibilities that came with the Durst name. He would sit in high-level board meetings and stare blankly at the wall. ignoring the multi-million-dollar deals being discussed around him. His presence in the family office was that of a ghost, a silent observer of a fortune he felt no connection to. This disconnect from reality was the catalyst for the Kathleen McCormick disappearance, a mystery that would haunt the family for over 40 years. Robert married Kathleen, a beautiful dental hygienist from a middle-class background, but the marriage was never about love. To the Dursts, Kathleen was a liability and a leak in the financial hull of the organization. Robert did not want a partner. He wanted a possession that he could control with the same coldness his father used to control real estate. When she tried to break free and establish her own life, the immense power of the Durst Empire began to move against her. The family used their wealth to build a wall of protection around Robert, ensuring that no scandal could touch the corporate brand. They had spent decades cultivating relationships with the city's most powerful figures, from the mayor's office to the highest levels of the police department. This influence meant that when a young woman went missing, the investigation was treated with a level of caution that bordered on complicity. There were no aggressive search warrants and no forensic sweeps of the vast family estates. Money does not just buy luxury goods. It buys the ability to make the truth disappear. Robert walked away from the initial disappearance of his wife with a shrug and a massive check from the family trust. He was free to spend his millions on a new life of quiet, high-end isolation, far away from the prying eyes of the New York press. But the internal rot of the Durst lineage could not be contained forever by offshore accounts or shell companies. The empire's foundation was built on greed, and it was only a matter of time before the eldest son decided to tear the whole structure down. The transition from a real estate heir to a fugitive was not a sudden fall, but a slow descent into a madness that even $1 billion could not cure. This legacy of gold and blood was set in stone the moment Robert realized you could get away with anything. He spent his days traveling the country under false identities, using his massive wealth to fund a nomadic existence that kept him one step ahead of justice. He was a man who could buy a private jet, but preferred the anonymity of a Greyhound bus. This calculated rejection of his status was his ultimate weapon, allowing him to hide in plain sight while the world searched for a billionaire. The stage was set for a final confrontation between the power of an old money dynasty and the stubborn persistence of a cold case. Robert Durst believed he was smarter than the law because he had never been forced to answer to it. He treated life like a game of Monopoly, where he held all the high-value properties and the get-out-of-jail-free cards. But wealth has a way of creating a false sense of invulnerability that eventually leads to catastrophic mistakes. He was about to find out that while his family name could shield him from the police, it could not shield him from his own arrogance. The cracks in the empire were widening, and the dark history of the Durst family was about to be dragged into the light of the 21st century. Seymour Durst was a shark who navigated the concrete canyons of Manhattan with a predatory grace. He did not merely buy buildings, he strangled his competition by outweighting them and outmaneuvering them in the dark corners of City Hall. By the 1970s, the Durst Organization had successfully weaponized the concept of the assemblage. They would quietly buy up small, crumbling brownstones and low-rise shops on a single block, holding them for decades if necessary, until they owned the entire footprint. This strategy allowed them to consolidate a massive chunk of Third Avenue, turning fragmented lots into monolithic glass towers. At a time when New York was flirting with bankruptcy and arson, the Dursts were doubling down on the dirt. They were worth over $500 million during an era of stagflation and urban decay. That figure translates to nearly $3 billion in today's purchasing power, a fortune built on the cold calculation that the city would eventually belong to the highest bidder. The Durst family became the undisputed kings of the skyscraper, but the crown was heavy and jagged. Inside the executive suites, the atmosphere was thick with a specific kind of corporate paranoia. Robert was the heir apparent, the eldest son groomed to take the throne of an empire that controlled thousands of residential and commercial units. Yet he functioned as a ghost in his own office, a haunting presence that unsettled the staff and his own father. He would sit in high-stakes board meetings and stare blankly at the wall, ignoring the multi-million-dollar spreadsheets laid out before him. While other developers were obsessed with the aesthetics of their buildings, Robert seemed obsessed with the power to ignore them. He treated the family's vast roster of tenants like insects, showing a chilling lack of empathy for the human lives that occupied his balance sheets. The internal rivalry between the brothers was a slow-motion collision that defined the organization's future. While his younger brother Douglas was a disciplined student of tax abatements, zoning laws, and the intricate machinery of the New York real estate lobby, Robert focused entirely on the thrill of control. Robert viewed the business not as a legacy to be preserved, but as a personal playground where he could exert his will without consequence. He began to drift away from the family's rigid expectations, seeking out a life that his father viewed as a liability. This friction reached a boiling point when Robert met and married a young dental hygienist named Kathleen McCormick. She was beautiful, vibrant, and firmly middle class, representing everything the Durst dynasty tried to insulate itself against. To Seymour and the board, she was not a daughter-in-law. She was a leak in the financial hull of their unsinkable ship. Robert's relationship with Kathleen quickly devolved from a romance into a psychological siege. He did not want a wife who had her own ambitions or a desire for medical school. He wanted a possession that stayed in its assigned place. As Kathleen began to push for her own independence, the immense machinery of the Durst empire began to grind her down. Robert used his wealth as a leash, alternating between lavish gifts and terrifying outbursts of physical and emotional isolation. The more she tried to leave, the more he tightened his grip, using the family's resources to monitor her every move. He was a man who had been taught that everything in New York had a price, and every person was a piece of property. When the marriage finally fractured beyond repair, the true nature of the Durst monopoly revealed itself. It was no longer just about owning the land. It was about owning the narrative of what happened behind closed doors. The Durst lifestyle was defined by a quiet, terrifying brand of power that preferred the shadows to the spotlight. While contemporaries like the Trumps were busy plastering their names in gold leaf across every available surface, the Dursts operated with a calculated invisibility. They understood that real power does not scream. It whispers in the ears of judges and architects of public policy. They hid their staggering wealth in a labyrinth of offshore trusts, shell companies, and layered partnerships that made it nearly impossible for any outsider to trace the true extent of their holdings. Robert lived in a penthouse that overlooked the very city his family helped build, but he moved through his life like a trespasser. He was a man who could buy anything on earth, but felt he owned nothing, driven by a deep-seated insecurity that even a billion-dollar inheritance could not soothe. This insecurity manifested as a clinical need for surveillance and total dominance over his environment. Robert spent tens of thousands of dollars from his personal accounts on private investigators, not to protect the family business, but to watch his own siblings and cousins. He was obsessed with the idea that he was being cheated out of his rightful place at the head of the table, and he used his millions to build a private intelligence network. The family's influence was so deeply embedded in the fabric of New York that it reached the highest levels of the mayor's office and the police commissioner's inner circle. They were the ultimate insiders, the people who provided the campaign donations that kept the city's political machinery humming. This invisible shield of status meant that the Dursts were often treated as a sovereign entity rather than a group of private citizens. When Kathleen McCormick disappeared on a cold night in 1982, the Durst name acted as a high-frequency jammer against the signals of justice. In a typical missing person case involving a middle-class woman, the police would have swarmed the husband's properties and conducted aggressive forensic sweeps. But Robert was not a typical husband. He was a Durst. No search warrants were issued for the family's sprawling estate in South Salem, and no forensic teams were sent to analyze the floorboards of their city apartment. The investigation was handled with a degree of deference that bordered on complicity, as the authorities seemed hesitant to offend a family that held the keys to the city's skyline. Money in this world does not just buy luxury cars and fine art. It buys the benefit of the doubt and the luxury of silence. Robert walked away from the disappearance of his wife with little more than a shrug and a massive recurring check from the family trust. The empire prioritized the protection of the brand over the discovery of the truth, effectively insulating Robert from the consequences of his own volatility. He was free to retreat into a life of high-end isolation, wandering between properties in Vermont, New York, and beyond, always funded by the relentless revenue of the Manhattan skyscrapers. He became a nomad of the elite, a man with $100 million in liquid cash and nowhere to truly call home. This absolute freedom, granted by his name and his bank account, allowed his inner darkness to fester. He had learned the most dangerous lesson a man of his stature can learn: that the rules of the physical world do not apply to those who own the ground they stand on. The Durst lifestyle was a masterclass in the terrifying architecture of quiet power. They did not operate with the loud, gold-plated flash of the Trumps or the celebrity-seeking hunger of the modern tech elite. Instead, they weaponized their wealth to buy something far more valuable than jewelry or yachts. They bought the ability to remain invisible while standing in the middle of a neon-lit room. Robert lived in a luxury penthouse that overlooked the very skyline his father helped build. Yet he moved through his own life like a ghost haunting a machine. He spent thousands of dollars on private investigators, not to protect his interests, but to stalk his own family members and monitor his wife. He was a man who could purchase anything on the planet, yet he felt as though he owned nothing because he was never truly in control of his own impulses. The family influence reached into every corner of the New York establishment, from the mahogany desks of the mayor's office to the highest levels of the police commissioner's inner circle. When Kathleen McCormick disappeared in 1982, the Durst name acted as a titanium shield against the standard procedures of the law. There were no immediate search warrants issued for the family's sprawling estate. There were no aggressive forensic sweeps of the penthouse or the stone cottage in South Salem where the couple spent their weekends. In the high-stakes world of Manhattan real estate, money does not just buy luxury goods or fine art. It buys the heavy, suffocating weight of silence. It buys the benefit of the doubt that a middle-class victim is never afforded. Robert walked away from the disappearance of his wife with little more than a cold shrug and a massive check from the family trust. While the McCormick family pleaded for answers and searched for a body that seemed to have vanished into thin air, Robert retreated into a life of high-end isolation. He spent his days drifting between properties, fueled by a bottomless bank account that allowed him to outrun any question or any detective who dared to look too closely. He was a man insulated by a layer of capital so thick that the screams of the past could not penetrate it. He didn't have to explain himself to the police because the family lawyers spoke a language of litigation and delay that kept the authorities at bay for decades. This gilded existence was not about happiness, but about the absolute absence of consequences. Robert spent his millions on a life of quiet luxury that served as a fortress against reality. He understood that as long as the Durst Organization continued to pump out dividends, his personal life was an inconvenience that the family would pay to keep quiet. He moved in the shadows of the very skyscrapers that bore his name, a prince of the city who was fundamentally disconnected from the humanity of the people around him. He treated the world like a game of chess where he was the only player allowed to move the pieces. The wealth gave him a sense of divine right, a feeling that laws were merely suggestions for people who didn't have 8 figures in a liquid account. But even a fortress built of gold and steel has its structural weaknesses. While the Durst name protected him from the outside world, it could not protect him from the rot growing within the family itself. The power dynamics of the dynasty were shifting, and the very money that had been his shield was about to become his greatest source of resentment. The silence he had purchased for so long was starting to echo with the sounds of a family that was growing tired of his erratic behavior. They had spent years scrubbing his reputation, but even the most powerful cleaning agents have their limits when the stains are made of blood. The foundation was beginning to tremble, and the man who thought he was untouchable was about to learn that even the tallest building can be brought down by a single focused crack. The empire finally turned on its eldest son when the internal politics of the Durst Organization shifted from supportive to predatory. In the early 1990s, Seymour Durst reached the end of his long, calculated reign and was forced to choose a successor to lead the multi-billion-dollar machine into the new millennium. He looked at Robert and saw a man who was increasingly unstable, a man who preferred the company of stray dogs to the company of power brokers. In a move that shattered the family's fragile peace, Seymour bypassed his firstborn and handed the keys to the kingdom to the younger brother, Douglas. This was not just a corporate promotion. It was a public excommunication from the bloodline's primary source of power. Robert's reaction to this betrayal was as vulgar as it was calculated. He walked into his brother's office, stood before the desk that represented the center of the family's Manhattan dominion, and urinated in a wastebasket while his colleagues watched in horrified silence. It was a visceral declaration of war against the very institution that had spent a decade protecting him from the police. He realized that he was no longer the heir to the skyline, but a liability to be managed. To settle the score, he launched a series of legal maneuvers that eventually resulted in a $65 million buyout in 2006. This massive infusion of cash was intended to buy his permanent disappearance, a golden parachute that would allow the Durst Organization to erase his name from their corporate brochures forever. With $65 million in his pocket and a heart full of burning resentment, the billionaire became a nomad. He cut all ties with the glass towers of Midtown and began traveling the country under a rotation of false identities and cheap disguises. He was a man worth the equivalent of a small nation's treasury, yet he chose to live in a $300 a month basement apartment in Galveston, Texas. In one of the most bizarre chapters of his long evasion, he pretended to be a mute woman named Dorothy Signer. He wore cheap wigs and thrift store dresses, hiding his elite Manhattan accent behind a self-imposed vow of silence. He was hiding in plain sight, proving that a man with enough money can become anyone he wants, or no one at all. This descent into the shadows was fueled by the same hubris that defined his father and grandfather. Robert believed that because he had escaped the disappearance of his wife, he was fundamentally smarter than the law and more capable than his brother. He lived a double life, alternating between the grimy reality of a Texas rental and the high-end hotels where he still used his real name to access his vast fortune. The money allowed him to maintain a fleet of rental cars and a collection of burner phones, creating a digital and physical labyrinth that no small-town detective could hope to navigate. He was playing a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek with a world that had forgotten he existed, convinced that the Durst bloodline made him invincible. However, the isolation of his nomadic life only served to sharpen his predatory instincts. While he was hiding in Texas, the past began to claw its way back to the surface in the form of a long-lost friend and a nosy neighbor. The hubris of the Durst dynasty told him that he could simply eliminate any obstacle that stood in his way, just as his father had eliminated rivals in the real estate market. He didn't realize that the world outside of the Manhattan boardroom operated by different rules. He was no longer protected by the family's political connections or their influence over the police commissioner. He was alone in the dark, and the trail of bodies he left behind was finally starting to glow under the light of a new investigation. The end of the road didn't come from a dramatic police raid or a high-speed chase through the streets of Houston. It came from the most unlikely of places, a documentary film crew that was given unprecedented access to the man behind the myth. The silver spoon was beginning to tarnish, and the corrosion started from within. For decades, Robert Durst had been the uncomfortable shadow lurking in the corner of the Durst Organization boardrooms. While his father, Seymour, was busy redrawing the New York City skyline with steel and stone, Robert was drifting into a state of psychological decay. The family saw his erratic behavior as a nuisance, something to be managed with high-priced lawyers and quiet payoffs. But by the early 1990s, the dynamic of the dynasty shifted in a way that Robert could not tolerate. The empire was no longer a playground for the eldest son. It was a machine that required a steady hand, and Seymour realized that Robert's hand was anything but steady. The internal coup was clinical and cold. Seymour Durst, a man who valued the legacy of the family name above all else, made the executive decision to bypass the traditional laws of primogeniture. He looked past his firstborn and handed the keys of the multi-billion-dollar kingdom to his younger son, Douglas. This wasn't just a corporate reorganization. It was a public execution of Robert's status. To the outside world, it looked like a sensible business move. But to Robert,
It was the ultimate betrayal. He had spent his life being the heir apparent to a throne he didn't even want. Yet the moment it was taken from him, the rejection ignited a fire of pure, unadulterated spite. Robert's reaction to the news was as bizarre as it was repulsive. He didn't file a lawsuit or call a press conference. Instead, he walked into his brother's private office, stood over a wastebasket, and urinated in it while his brother watched in stunned silence. It was a visceral, primitive declaration of war against the very institution that birthed him. He was signaling that the family's prestige meant nothing more to him than a place to dispose of waste. This act of defiance marked the permanent severing of ties. Robert was no longer a real estate prince. He was a rogue agent with a massive chip on his shoulder and a dangerous amount of liquid capital at his disposal. The divorce from the family firm was finalized with a $65 million buyout in 2006. For most people, $65 million is a dream. For a Durst, it was a parting gift to ensure he never darkened their doorstep again. With his pockets lined with family gold, Robert transformed into a high-stakes nomad.
He abandoned the penthouses and the private clubs of Manhattan for a life of calculated anonymity. He began to treat his existence like a game of chess against an invisible opponent, moving across state lines and adopting identities that were increasingly surreal. The man who could have owned a skyscraper chose instead to disappear into the mundane fabric of the working class. The most chilling chapter of this descent took place in a cramped $300 a month apartment in Galveston, Texas. Here, a man worth nearly $100 million lived as a mute woman named Dorothy Signer. He wore a wig, practiced a high-pitched gait, and communicated through handwritten notes to avoid revealing his voice. It was a masterpiece of psychological camouflage. Robert wasn't hiding because he was poor. He was hiding because he enjoyed the power of being invisible. He was a billionaire playing a part in a low-budget tragedy, proving that his wealth gave him the ultimate luxury, the ability to opt out of reality entirely. This period of his life was defined by an incredible paradox of hubris. He believed that the Durst bloodline made him inherently superior to the law and the common people he lived among. He would shoplift small items from grocery stores despite having thousands of dollars in cash stuffed into his pockets. He was testing the world, seeing how much he could get away with before the golden shield of his inheritance finally shattered. He viewed himself as a ghost who could move through walls. But even ghosts leave footprints. The trail of bizarre behavior and suspicious disappearances was beginning to form a pattern that no amount of family influence could fully erase. The nomad's journey was not just an escape from his brother. It was an escape from the mounting evidence of his past. While he sat in his basement apartment in Texas, the cold cases in New York and California were slowly being dusted off. The world of old money and high-rise developments felt 1,000 miles away, but the mechanics of the legal system were finally grinding into gear. Robert Durst had spent his life thinking he was the one holding the leash. But as he moved from one cheap rental to another, he failed to realize that he was the one being hunted. The cracks in the foundation were no longer just personal. They were structural, and the entire edifice of his protection was about to come crashing down. The collapse of Robert Durst was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing decay of a man who thought his bank account made him invisible. For decades, the heir to the Manhattan skyline had operated under the assumption that a billionaire could simply walk away from any shadow he cast. He had successfully navigated the disappearance of his wife and the gruesome dismemberment of a neighbor in Texas using high-priced lawyers and a sheer, chilling indifference to human life. But the ultimate trap was not set by the Federal Bureau of Investigation or a high-powered district attorney. It was laid by a documentary film crew and a single piece of paper that had been sitting in a police evidence file for 15 long years. This was the moment the open loop of the Durst mystery finally snapped shut, proving that while money can buy a clean slate, it cannot rewrite the physical evidence of the past. The key to his undoing was a small, unassuming envelope addressed to the Beverly Hills Police Department in the year 2000. Inside that envelope was a note that simply read, "Cadaver," along with the address of Susan Berman, Robert's longtime confidant and protector. For over a decade, the author of that note remained a ghost. The handwriting was distinctive, blocky, and contained a glaring spelling error, as the writer had spelled Beverley as Beverley. Robert had always denied being in Los Angeles at the time of Susan's death, and without a witness or a confession, the Durst millions kept the investigators at bay. He was a man who lived in the gaps between the truth, using his wealth to hire private investigators who harassed the families of his victims, while he played the role of the eccentric, misunderstood billionaire. The turning point came when Robert's own vanity led him to participate in a multi-part documentary series. He believed he could outsmart the filmmakers just as he had outsmarted the legal system in Galveston. During the production, the filmmakers were handed a bombshell piece of evidence by Susan Berman's stepson. It was a letter Robert had sent to Susan years earlier, long before she was eliminated. When the producers placed the two documents side by side, the world stopped turning for the Durst family. The handwriting was a perfect match. Most importantly, the spelling of Beverley was identical in its error on both the letter and the anonymous cadaver note. The billionaire had provided the very handwriting sample that linked him to the scene of a cold case. A mistake born of pure, unchecked hubris. The climax of this decades-long game of hide-and-seek occurred in a cramped bathroom while Robert was still wearing a live wireless microphone. He had just been confronted with the matching handwriting samples and was visibly shaken, his face a mask of twitching nerves. He excused himself, oblivious to the fact that the audio was still recording every whisper. In the privacy of that stall, the man worth $100 million began to argue with himself. He muttered about being caught, and then uttered the words that would eventually end his life in a prison ward. He whispered that he had killed them all, of course. It was a staggering moment of self-incrimination that no lawyer in the world could suppress. The mask of the real estate prince had finally cracked, revealing the hollow monster underneath. As the documentary aired, the legal machinery that had been stalled for 30 years suddenly roared to life. Robert knew the end was coming and attempted one final escape, fleeing to New Orleans under a false name with a latex mask and a suitcase full of cash. He was captured in a cheap hotel room, a pathetic shadow of the man who once controlled the boardrooms of Midtown. The Durst Organization, seeing the writing on the wall, moved with surgical precision to sever all ties. They didn't offer him a legal defense this time. They offered him a complete erasure from their corporate history. They understood that while one member of the dynasty could be sacrificed, the $8 billion empire had to be protected at all costs. The trial was a post-mortem of a life lived above the law. The prosecution meticulously dismantled the wall of protection that the Durst name had provided since 1982.
They showed how Robert used his liquid assets to buy silence, to move across borders, and to manipulate the people around him like chess pieces. The man who once lived in the most expensive penthouses in the world was now confined to a wheelchair in a courtroom, listening to the echoes of his own voice on a recorded loop. The mechanical precision of the real estate industry, which requires every contract to be signed and every deed to be recorded, had finally turned against him. A single signature on a letter to a friend had become his death warrant. In the end, the collapse was total. Robert Durst was convicted of the death of Susan Berman, a verdict that served as a proxy for all the lives he had destroyed. He died shortly after the sentencing, a ward of the state he had spent his entire life defying. The money that had once acted as a shield was now useless, sitting in frozen accounts while the family he hated continued to build skyscrapers in his shadow.
The empire he was supposed to lead didn't skip a beat, proving the ultimate cold truth of old money dynasties. The institution is immortal, but the individuals are entirely disposable. The man who tried to erase his tracks ended up leaving a trail so bright that it eventually led the world straight to his door. The story of the Durst collapse is a grim reminder that gravity eventually claims everyone, even those who believe they have bought their way out of the atmosphere. He spent $65 million to disappear, but he couldn't spend a single cent to change the handwriting on a 15-year-old envelope. The collapse wasn't just a legal defeat, it was a philosophical one. It proved that the truth is the only thing a billionaire cannot buy, and that the history of a dynasty is often written in the blood of those it leaves behind. As the dust settled on his conviction, the Manhattan skyline remained unchanged, a cold monument to a family that survived a monster by simply waiting for him to talk himself into a cage. Robert Durst died in a prison hospital in early 2022, but his departure was far from the quiet end a billionaire typically enjoys. He left behind a legacy defined by blood, litigation, and the haunting silence of those he silenced first. The Durst Organization still stands as a titan of the New York skyline, currently holding a massive stake in the iconic One World Trade Center. They are worth over $8 billion today, yet the name is forever stained by the actions of the heir who preferred the shadows to the boardroom. The money did not vanish with Robert. It simply moved into more secretive trusts, shielded by a family that mastered the art of corporate survival long before the first gavel fell. Douglas Durst remains one of the most powerful and influential men in New York real estate, proving that an empire can survive a monster if it possesses enough capital and institutional will. The family spent tens of millions of dollars on elite public relations firms to bury the ghost of Robert and protect the brand from his toxic fallout. They succeeded in the world of business, maintaining their grip on Midtown Manhattan, but they failed in the bond of blood. The Durst story serves as a chilling reminder that in the world of old money, the institution is the only thing that truly matters. The individuals within it are treated as disposable assets, and even a brother can become a liability to be liquidated for the sake of the balance sheet. The organizational structure of the Durst Empire was redesigned to ensure that no single person could ever threaten the family's collective wealth again. Following Robert's trial and subsequent death,
The family tightened their grip on their 13 million square feet of office space, ensuring the cash flow remained uninterrupted by scandal. They moved their assets through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts that even the most dedicated investigators found impossible to fully map. While Robert was the face of the family's madness, the rest of the clan became the face of its cold, calculating efficiency. They chose the path of the silent predator, knowing that in New York, power is best exercised behind closed doors and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. The autopsy of this empire reveals a fundamental truth about extreme wealth and its ability to distort justice over decades. Robert Durst was able to evade the consequences of his actions for 39 years because the initial investigation into his wife's disappearance was stifled by the weight of his father's influence. The police did not want to kick down the doors of a family that helped build the city's infrastructure and funded its political campaigns.
By the time the law finally caught up to Robert, he had already lived a full life of luxury and chaos, proving that for the ultra-wealthy, justice is often a delayed transaction rather than an immediate consequence. The legal fees alone for his various trials exceeded the lifetime earnings of the people he was accused of harming. Even in death, Robert Durst's financial footprint continues to trigger legal battles between his widow, the McCormick family, and the Durst Organization itself. The $100 million he retained after his buyout became a final bone of contention, a pile of gold that no one wanted to touch, but everyone wanted to control. The litigation surrounding his estate ensures that the Durst name stays in the headlines, a constant thorn in the side of a family that desperately wants to be known only for their green building initiatives and philanthropic donations. It is the ultimate irony that the man who wanted to erase his tracks left behind a trail of paper and blood that the family can never truly wash away. Gravity is a constant that eventually pulls every high-rise and every ego back to the earth. Robert Durst believed his wealth made him a god who could manipulate reality and rewrite the rules of human morality. In the end, he was just a frail man in a cheap prison suit, trapped by the very words he thought he could use to charm the world. Wealth can build skyscrapers that touch the clouds, but it cannot build a prison strong enough or a vault deep enough to hide the truth forever. The empire remains standing, but the crown is tarnished beyond repair, a monument to the high cost of keeping a killer in the family. If you want to see how the other half lives and dies, stay tuned. Subscribe to keep following the money.